The neighborhood had been built to look permanent, the kind of place designed to convince people that nothing bad could happen if everything appeared orderly enough. The streets curved gently, not to follow the land, but to slow cars and create the illusion of calm. Lawns were measured in inches, not just in height but in conformity, each blade of grass trained into obedience by unspoken pressure and written rules. Every house wore the same polite smile. Neutral colors approved by a committee, roofs angled at identical pitches, driveways uncracked and clean as if imperfections themselves were violations. The HOA sold this perfection as safety, as investment, as peace of mind, and for a long time most residents accepted that bargain without question. I had too. I paid my dues on time, kept my trash cans exactly where the diagram said they should go, and nodded politely at the emails that arrived with alarming regularity, each one reminding us that order was fragile and needed constant enforcement. The first sign that this balance was a lie came quietly, not with confrontation or threats, but with a small, unmistakable problem that couldn't be ignored. My roof began to fail. It started as a faint discoloration on the ceiling, a shadow that appeared after heavy rain and disappeared just long enough to be dismissed as condensation. But shadows have a way of growing when left alone. Over weeks, the stain widened, the drywall softened, and the smell of damp insulation crept into rooms that were supposed to feel secure. I did what any responsible homeowner would do. I called a licensed inspector, then a roofing contractor, then the city's permitting office. The diagnosis was simple and urgent: damaged flashing and compromised shingles that needed immediate repair to prevent structural damage. The city agreed, issuing permits without hesitation. Everything was by the book, documented, stamped, and approved. In any rational system, that should have been the end of the story. Instead, it was the beginning. The HOA notice arrived 3 days after the first repair crew showed up, taped neatly to my door like a warning label. It cited violations in a tone that pretended neutrality but carried something sharper underneath. Unauthorized exterior modification, failure to obtain HOA architectural approval, potential fine pending review. There was no acknowledgement of the permits, no curiosity about the damage, no concern for safety, just a declaration that I had crossed an invisible line. I responded the same day, attaching copies of the permits, photographs of the damage, and a timeline showing that delay would have caused far more harm. The reply, when it came, was shorter than my explanation and colder than the rain that had started this mess. HOA approval, it said, was separate from city approval. Repairs could have waited. Fines would be assessed until compliance was achieved. Compliance, in this case, meant stopping work on a leaking roof to satisfy a committee that met once a month. The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't my ceiling slowly dissolving above me. As the repairs continued under permit and common sense, the fines began to stack up. Each week brought another letter, each one more insistent, as if repetition itself could transform nonsense into authority. I started to notice how the HOA communicated, not just with me, but with the entire neighborhood. Emails went out praising community standards while quietly threatening enforcement. Names were never mentioned publicly, but everyone knew who was being targeted. Doors closed a little faster when I walked by. Conversations on sidewalks grew shorter. The system worked not because it was fair, but because it was effective at isolating people. What the HOA didn't realize was that isolation sharpens observation. While I documented my own situation, I began to see patterns. Certain houses received leniency, others didn't. Approvals seemed arbitrary, depending less on rules and more on relationships. Then there was the house 3 doors down. It had been undergoing a renovation far more extensive than my roof repair. Heavy machinery, structural changes, and a garage expansion that altered the footprint of the property. Everyone noticed it, not because it was disruptive, but because it was unusually fast. No posted permits, no delays, no HOA notices taped to doors. The work moved forward as if guided by invisible hands, clearing every obstacle. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't my business, and after weeks of dealing with fines and paperwork, I had enough to worry about. But when my roof passed its final city inspection with no issues, and the HOA still refused to acknowledge the permits, something shifted. This was no longer about rules, it was about control. I requested records through the channels available to homeowners, minutes from HOA meetings, approval logs, architectural reviews. The responses were slow and incomplete, but gaps have a way of speaking louder than words. The garage renovation appeared in none of the records I received. No approvals, no inspections, no conditions, yet it continued unchallenged. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One rainy afternoon, as my repaired roof shed water exactly as it should, a sound echoed through the neighborhood that didn't belong. It wasn't thunder. It was sharper, heavier, followed by a vibration that traveled through the ground. Sirens arrived soon after, their urgency cutting through the carefully maintained calm. The garage 3 doors down had collapsed. Not cosmetically, not partially, but catastrophically. Concrete had cracked, beams had failed, and the structure had folded in on itself like it had been built from cardboard instead of steel and stone. No one was killed, but injuries were reported, and the damage extended beyond the garage itself, compromising the adjoining wall of the house. Neighbors gathered at a distance, drawn by shock and curiosity, whispering questions that had no immediate answers. How could this happen in a place so obsessed with standards? Inspectors arrived, then more officials, their expressions grim as they surveyed the wreckage. It didn't take long for rumors to form, and it took even less time for the HOA to attempt control. Emails went out urging residents not to speculate, reminding everyone that safety investigations were ongoing, and emphasizing that the HOA took compliance seriously. The irony was so thick it felt deliberate. As the days passed, details emerged despite the attempts at silence. The renovation had been approved quickly without proper review. Inspections had been skipped or signed off remotely. The contractor, it turned out, had personal connections within the HOA board. What had collapsed wasn't just a garage, but the illusion that rules were applied equally. Neighbors who had once kept their distance began asking questions, not just about the accident, but about their own experiences with fines, delays, and selective enforcement. I realized then that my roof wasn't a side story. It was a thread connected to something much larger. Every letter, every fine, every ignored permit was evidence of a system that punished compliance and rewarded convenience. I organized my documents carefully, timelines aligning with inspection reports, HOA notices stacked against city approvals. Patterns became clear when laid out side by side. The garage collapse had consequences far beyond one property. Neighbors were injured. Property values were threatened. Insurance companies started asking uncomfortable questions. Lawsuits began to form, not just against the homeowner, but against the HOA itself for negligence and failure to enforce its own rules. When attorneys started knocking on doors, they weren't just looking for victims. They were looking for proof, and I had it. As Chapter 1 closes, the neighborhood stands at a crossroads. The calm surface cracked like the concrete of a fallen garage, and the fight over a simple roof repair is about to become the foundation of something far more damaging to those who thought they were untouchable. The days after the garage collapse felt different in a way that was hard to explain but impossible to miss. The neighborhood still looked the same on the surface. Lawns trimmed, cars parked neatly in driveways, flags hanging at identical heights, yet something underneath had shifted. The illusion of permanence had cracked, and once people noticed that crack, they couldn't stop looking at it. Conversations that once revolved around weather and maintenance tips quietly transformed into whispered comparisons of fines, warnings, and unexplained approvals. People who had avoided HOA meetings for years suddenly wanted copies of bylaws they had never read. The collapse didn't just damage one property, it destabilized trust, and trust was the invisible load-bearing structure holding the entire community together. I kept my head down publicly, continuing my routine as if nothing had changed, but privately I documented everything with renewed purpose. Every email from the HOA, every notice with a timestamp, every contradictory statement was saved, backed up, and organized. I knew enough to understand that when systems fail, they don't fail all at once. They unravel thread by thread, and whoever controls the narrative during that unraveling often determines who takes the fall. The HOA board moved quickly to shape that narrative. A community-wide email framed the collapse as an unforeseeable accident, emphasizing that construction inherently carried risks, and that the board had acted in good faith based on information provided by the homeowner and contractor. The wording was careful, legalistic, and strangely detached from reality. There was no mention of skipped inspections, no acknowledgement of missing permits, no explanation of how a renovation so extensive had sailed through without scrutiny while my roof repair had been treated like an act of rebellion. The message urged unity, patience, and confidence in leadership. To many residents, it sounded hollow. Within days, investigators confirmed what many suspected. Structural supports had been improperly installed. Load calculations were incorrect. Materials didn't meet code. These were not minor oversights, but fundamental failures that any competent review process should have caught. The HOA's architectural approval, which they so aggressively defended in my case, suddenly became an inconvenient subject. Requests for records multiplied. Neighbors filed formal inquiries. Insurance adjusters asked for documentation the HOA struggled to produce. The board's confidence began to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. While all this unfolded, my fines continued. Another letter arrived, almost absurd in its timing, demanding payment for ongoing noncompliance related to my roof. It felt surreal, like being fined for standing in the wrong place while the building behind the enforcer burned down. I responded once more calmly, attaching my permits again and referencing the completed inspection. This time I added a single sentence asking whether the board planned to apply the same standards of urgency and enforcement to unresolved safety concerns elsewhere in the community. The reply never came. Silence, I learned, was often louder than threats. Meanwhile, neighbors began reaching out quietly. At first it was subtle, a question asked during a chance meeting by the mailbox, a comment made during an evening walk. Then it became more direct. People wanted to know how I handled permits, why I kept such detailed records, whether I thought the HOA could actually be held accountable. Many shared their own stories, years of small frustrations dismissed as the cost of living in a managed community, fines for minor violations, delays that cost money, requests denied without explanation. Individually, these stories sounded petty. Together, they formed a pattern of behavior that painted a very different picture of leadership. I listened more than I spoke, careful not to position myself as a leader or agitator. I understood that credibility comes from restraint. Let others reach their own conclusions. The legal consequences of the garage collapse escalated quickly. The injured neighbors retained attorneys. Their insurance companies began investigating not just the contractor, but the approval process that allowed the work to proceed. Subpoenas followed. The HOA board, once so confident in issuing fines and warnings, now scrambled to respond to formal requests they couldn't intimidate into silence. Meetings that had once been sparsely attended became standing room-only events, though the board limited public comments and controlled agendas with increasing desperation. The tension in those rooms was thick, heavy with unspoken accusations. Every mention of compliance sounded ironic. Every reference to standards felt accusatory. I sat quietly during those meetings, observing how language shifted when power felt threatened. The board emphasized collective responsibility, implying that everyone shared in the consequences of the collapse. This tactic backfired almost immediately. Residents who had paid thousands in dues over the years began asking what those dues were actually funding. Legal counsel, it turned out. Damage control. The very people who enforced rules were now using community funds to defend themselves against the consequences of selective enforcement. As weeks passed, evidence began to surface in more concrete forms. Emails leaked showing expedited approvals. Messages revealed friendly familiarity between board members and the contractor. Dates didn't line up. Signatures appeared on documents before inspections supposedly occurred. Each revelation chipped away at the HOA's narrative of good faith. The board's tone changed again, this time becoming defensive and procedural, emphasizing that processes were being reviewed and improvements implemented. It was too late. The damage was no longer theoretical. Properties adjacent to the collapsed garage suffered foundation issues. Home values dipped as the incident made its way into public records. Prospective buyers asked questions no one wanted to answer. And through it all, my roof sat quietly, repaired, inspected, and compliant with every legitimate authority, yet still technically in violation according to a board that now struggled to defend its own decisions. That contradiction became impossible to ignore. Attorneys representing the injured neighbors eventually contacted me, not because of my roof, but because my situation illustrated a pattern they needed to prove. They wanted timelines, copies of fines, evidence of enforcement priorities. I provided everything methodically and without commentary. Facts, when organized properly, speak louder than outrage. They create narratives that are difficult to dismantle because they don't rely on emotion. The more documentation I shared, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't a single mistake. It was systemic negligence masked by authority. As Chapter 2 draws to a close, the neighborhood stands divided not by fences or property lines, but by awareness. Some still cling to the belief that the HOA will fix itself, that this was an anomaly, an unfortunate accident. Others have crossed a threshold they can't return from, having seen how power behaves when unchallenged. Lawsuits advance, questions multiply, and the fines on my roof remain unpaid, no longer a burden but a symbol, waiting for the moment when accountability finally catches up to control. By the time the third week after the collapse arrived, The neighborhood no longer felt like a community bound by shared rules, but like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. The rhythm of daily life continued, cars leaving for work, lights turning on at dusk, sprinklers clicking on at regulated times, yet every routine carried a sense of performance, as if everyone was acting normal while privately counting evidence. The HOA board tried to reclaim control through procedure, flooding inboxes with updates about policy reviews, safety audits, and the formation of special committees. The language was familiar, polished, and intentionally vague. It promised action without admitting fault, progress without accountability. To anyone who had never questioned authority, it might have sounded reassuring. To those paying attention, it sounded like delay. I continued documenting quietly, not just my own case, but the shifting behavior of the board itself. Tone changes mattered. Timing mattered. The way certain words disappeared from emails and were replaced with others was revealing. Violation became concern. Fine became assessment under review. Power was recalibrating itself in real time, attempting to soften its edges now that scrutiny had arrived. What the board did not realize was that softening too late often looks like admission. The garage site remained cordoned off, a visible scar in the middle of the neighborhood. Tarps flapped in the wind, and temporary supports stood where walls once had. Inspectors came and went, sometimes daily, their presence a reminder that external authority had entered a space the HOA once ruled without challenge. Residents walked past slowly, pretending not to stare, yet unable to look away. It had become a symbol not just of structural failure, but of misplaced trust. Every cracked beam told a story the board couldn't rewrite. Meanwhile, my roof repair, now fully complete, became an unintentional control case. It was a visible example of work done correctly, approved by legitimate authorities, inspected and certified safe. And yet, according to the HOA's internal system, it remained unresolved. The fines were still listed on my account. Interest began to accrue. That contradiction, once frustrating, now became strategic. Attorneys representing the injured neighbors asked me not to challenge the fines just yet. They explained that the persistence of enforcement against me, despite clear compliance, strengthened the argument that the HOA applied its rules selectively and irrationally. So I waited. Each new notice became another data point, another line item in a growing case file. Neighbors noticed. Some asked why I didn't just pay to make it go away. Others, now more informed, understood exactly why I didn't. Paying would have erased a paper trail the HOA had created all on its own. As tensions rose, factions formed quietly. There were those who still defended the HOA, insisting that order required authority and that mistakes were inevitable. Many of them had never been fined, never delayed, never denied. Their experience of the system was smooth, frictionless, and therefore trustworthy. Then there were those who had stories, long memories of arbitrary decisions and quiet resentments. For them, the collapse wasn't shocking, it was confirmation. The line between these groups wasn't drawn by ideology but by experience. Privilege within the system bred loyalty, scrutiny bred skepticism. HOA meetings became increasingly controlled, public comment periods were shortened. Questions were redirected to legal counsel. The board members sat stiffer, spoke less freely, and avoided eye contact. They were no longer administrators, they were defendants in waiting. One evening, a particularly tense meeting ended early when a resident asked a simple question about insurance coverage for the collapsed garage and adjacent damage. The board deferred, citing confidentiality. The room filled with murmurs. People weren't asking out of curiosity anymore. They were calculating risk. Could this happen to them? Would the HOA protect them or protect itself? Those questions lingered long after the meeting adjourned. Outside formal channels, information moved faster. Neighbors shared documents, screenshots, and timelines. A private group formed, not officially but organically, a place where people compared notes and realized how similar their experiences were. Patterns emerged with uncomfortable clarity. The same contractor appeared repeatedly in fast-tracked approvals. The same board members signed off on exceptions. The same homeowners received warnings for trivial issues, while others completed major alterations unchecked. It became clear that the HOA's authority wasn't just flawed, it was personalized. Rules bent around relationships. Safety took a backseat to convenience. Control was enforced downward, never sideways or upward. My role in all this remained deliberately limited. I didn't lead discussions or propose strategies. I provided facts when asked and documents when requested. The power of my position came from consistency. I never exaggerated. I never speculated. I let the contrast speak for itself. A roof repaired properly versus a garage collapsed under negligence. A homeowner fined for compliance versus a renovation approved into disaster. The simplicity of that comparison made it impossible to dismiss. As legal pressure mounted, the HOA's internal strain began to show. Board members resigned citing personal reasons. Others stopped responding to emails entirely. Replacement volunteers were hard to find. Few people wanted to step into leadership roles now associated with liability and public anger. The board hired additional legal counsel, further draining community funds. Notices went out about potential special assessments to cover unanticipated expenses. That phrase landed like a threat. Residents who had never questioned their dues now realized they were being asked to pay for someone else's mistakes. Trust eroded further. Insurance companies became less patient. Coverage questions turned into disputes. Some claims were delayed. Others were denied pending investigation. The reality set in that the collapse wasn't just a singular event, but a financial and legal earthquake whose aftershocks would last for years. Property values were already reflecting that uncertainty. Appraisals came in lower. Sales stalled. The HOA's promise of protecting investment looked increasingly hollow. Through it all, the fines on my account remained unchanged, stubbornly listed as overdue. It was almost impressive in its absurdity, a bureaucratic refusal to acknowledge reality even as that reality unraveled around it. Each notice felt less like an attempt at enforcement and more like a reflex, a system continuing its motions long after its authority had been compromised. As Chapter 3 comes to an end, the neighborhood stands fully aware that the conflict is no longer about one roof or one collapsed garage. It is about who controls accountability when authority fails, and whether a system built to manage appearances can survive the moment it is forced to confront substance. The fourth phase of the unraveling began not with an explosion, but with paperwork, the quiet kind that moves slowly until it doesn't. Requests for records turned into formal demands. Informal conversations hardened into sworn statements. What had once been gossip now required accuracy, dates, signatures, and corroboration. The neighborhood learned a new rhythm, one dictated by deadlines instead of lawn schedules. Every envelope carried weight. Every certified letter felt heavier than the last. The HOA board attempted to regain footing by announcing an independent review, a phrase chosen carefully to sound decisive without committing to outcomes. The review was framed as proactive, a sign of responsibility, yet its scope was conspicuously narrow. It focused on future improvements rather than past decisions, a forward-looking posture designed to avoid backward accountability. That choice did not go unnoticed. Residents had grown adept at reading between lines, recognizing deflection disguised as reform. The garage site remained a daily reminder that consequences were already here, not theoretical. Repairs had stalled due to disputes between insurers, contractors, and attorneys, leaving the structure frozen in its damaged state. The longer it sat, the more it symbolized institutional paralysis. I continued to live beneath my repaired roof, the irony deepening each time rain fell without issue. Safety had been restored through proper channels, yet punishment persisted through illegitimate ones. The fines accrued interest, crossing thresholds that triggered automated warnings. These notices were impersonal, generated by systems that did not understand context, only balances. That impersonality worked against the HOA now. Each automated notice contradicted their public assurances of flexibility and review. They were speaking two languages at once, one conciliatory, one punitive, and the mismatch became evidence. Attorneys representing the injured neighbors expanded their scope, naming not just the HOA as an entity, but individual decision-makers whose signatures appeared on approvals. The shift from abstract blame to personal exposure changed everything. Board members who once spoke confidently now deferred constantly. Statements became scripted. Silence became strategy. In private, fear began to replace authority. The neighborhood felt it. People who had once enforced rules eagerly now avoided eye contact. The sense of superiority that had accompanied enforcement evaporated under the threat of depositions and discovery. The power dynamic flipped quietly but decisively. Those who asked questions now held leverage. Those who issued fines now sought cover. I was asked to provide a sworn declaration outlining the timeline of my roof repair and subsequent enforcement actions. The request was precise, neutral, and thorough. I complied without embellishment. Dates, permits, inspections, notices, responses. The simplicity of the facts made them powerful. There was no drama in compliance, only clarity. The declaration became part of a growing record illustrating a pattern of behavior that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Neighbors who had once worried about retaliation now felt emboldened. Stories surfaced that had never been shared publicly, instances where repairs were delayed until damage worsened, where approvals were granted verbally and denied later in writing, where enforcement seemed to depend entirely on who you knew. These stories did not rely on emotion. They relied on documentation, receipts, emails, photographs. The HOA's internal consistency began to collapse under the weight of its own records. The board attempted another communication push, emphasizing transparency and cooperation. They announced open office hours, encouraged residents to bring concerns directly to management, and promised responsiveness. The gesture might have worked months earlier. Now it felt performative. Residents had learned that access without authority was meaningless. Meanwhile, insurance adjusters began sending their own letters, questioning coverage limits and exclusions. The financial reality sharpened. Potential special assessments loomed larger, no longer hypothetical. The idea that compliant homeowners might be asked to subsidize negligence elsewhere provoked quiet outrage. The sense of collective responsibility the HOA had once leaned on now fractured. People distinguished between community and governance, realizing they were not the same. Trust, once assumed, now had to be earned, and the HOA had little left to offer. As depositions approached, legal counsel advised minimizing communication. The board retreated further, canceling meetings and limiting updates. The absence created space for speculation, which quickly filled with facts uncovered through formal channels. Each new piece of information reinforced the same conclusion. The system had not failed accidentally. It had functioned exactly as designed, prioritizing convenience and relationships over safety and fairness. My unpaid fines remained, a growing number attached to my account, unchanged despite everything happening around them. That number became a quiet anchor in the storm, a reminder that systems often persist long after their legitimacy has expired. I did not challenge it. I let it sit, accruing significance alongside interest. As Chapter 4 closes, the neighborhood stands fully engaged in a process it never asked for but can no longer avoid. Authority has been exposed as conditional, compliance revealed as selective, and the difference between appearance and substance laid bare. The question is no longer whether the HOA made a mistake, but whether it can survive the consequences of how it chose to operate when no one was watching. By the time formal discovery began, the neighborhood no longer waited for updates from the HOA. Information arrived through attorneys, insurers, inspectors, and court filings, each source peeling back another layer of a system that had thrived on being unquestioned. What once felt like a slow burn turned into a steady, consuming heat. People checked mailboxes with apprehension, not for fines anymore, but for notices that might change their financial future. The HOA's attempt to maintain authority through routine collapsed as routine itself became evidence. Calendars filled with depositions, inspections, and meetings that no longer felt administrative but adversarial. The garage collapse had triggered a chain reaction that could not be contained within one property line. Structural engineers released preliminary findings that confirmed what many suspected. The failure was predictable, preventable, and the direct result of shortcuts taken during approval and oversight. Those findings circulated quickly, not through rumor, but through attachments forwarded from neighbor to neighbor. Facts replaced speculation. The HOA's legal counsel advised silence, which the board interpreted as invisibility. Notices grew shorter, updates less frequent. When communications did arrive, they were stripped of warmth, reduced to sterile language designed to minimize exposure. Residents noticed the shift immediately. This was no longer a community organization speaking. It was a legal entity protecting itself. My situation, once framed as an isolated dispute, became increasingly central to understanding how the HOA operated. Attorneys referenced my timeline in filings, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. Every step I took followed legitimate procedure. Every step the HOA took ignored it. The contrast was stark and easy to explain to anyone willing to look. The fines on my account crossed into 4 figures, a sum that would have frightened me months earlier. Now, it felt symbolic, almost deliberate. The HOA had created a liability trail that pointed directly back to itself. Neighbors who once urged compromise now encouraged patience. They understood that resolution too early would blunt the impact of accountability. Meanwhile, the homeowners affected by the garage collapse faced escalating hardships. Temporary housing became long-term displacement. Insurance disputes delayed repairs indefinitely. Stress fractured relationships within households already strained by uncertainty. These were not abstract damages. They were lived consequences of negligence approved by authority. The emotional toll rippled outward, reaching neighbors who suddenly realized how vulnerable they were to decisions made behind closed doors. Trust evaporated not through anger, but through awareness. HOA board members began receiving individual subpoenas. Some hired personal attorneys. Others attempted to distance themselves from past decisions, claiming reliance on management companies or consultants. Those defenses unraveled quickly under documentation. Signatures told stories memory could not rewrite. Emails contradicted statements. Timelines exposed coordination that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The idea that responsibility could be outsourced collapsed alongside the garage. Responsibility, it turned out, was personal. The community's tone shifted again, this time toward quiet resolve. Residents organized not to protest, but to prepare. Financial planners were consulted. Property owners reviewed insurance policies they had never read. Real estate agents fielded anxious questions about disclosures and market impact. The HOA's promise of protecting property values now sounded hollow, almost mocking. The very structure meant to safeguard investment had become its greatest threat. Through all of this, I maintained distance, not out of indifference, but out of strategy. I responded to legal requests promptly, avoided public commentary, and declined invitations to speculate. My restraint was misinterpreted by some as passivity. It was discipline. Every reaction was weighed against its potential to dilute the clarity of the facts. The power of my position lay in consistency. I had done nothing extraordinary. I followed the rules as written by legitimate authorities. The HOA punished me for it. That simplicity became the backbone of a case far larger than my roof. As depositions unfolded, fragments of the HOA's internal culture emerged. Testimony revealed informal practices, unwritten exceptions, and reliance on personal judgment over established criteria. Board members spoke of trust and familiarity as substitutes for verification. These admissions, casual in tone, carried devastating implications. Safety had been treated as optional, compliance as negotiable. Authority as personal. The narrative the HOA had tried to maintain, that of diligent oversight and good faith, collapsed under the weight of its own words. Meanwhile, the garage site finally saw movement, not repair, but dismantling. The damaged structure was deemed unsalvageable, its remains carefully removed under supervision. Watching the process felt symbolic. What had been built quickly and approved casually required painstaking effort to undo. Every beam removed felt like an admission. Every truckload hauled away marked the cost of shortcuts. Neighbors watched from a distance, aware that the debris represented more than concrete and steel. It represented a system being taken apart piece by piece. The HOA attempted one last pivot, proposing mediation and community reconciliation. The language emphasized healing, unity, and moving forward together. For some, the appeal resonated emotionally. For others, it rang hollow. Healing without accountability felt premature. Unity without acknowledgement felt manipulative. The offer of mediation did not pause legal proceedings. It simply revealed how desperate the board had become to regain control of the narrative. The unpaid fines on my account were finally addressed indirectly. A notice arrived stating that enforcement actions were under review pending the outcome of ongoing matters. It did not apologize. It did not retract. It paused. The pause was telling. Authority that once acted decisively now hesitated. The system that had once punished without question now waited for permission. That reversal was subtle but profound. It marked the moment when power shifted definitively away from the HOA and toward accountability enforced from the outside. As Chapter 5 draws to a close, the neighborhood exists in a state of suspended consequence. The damage is no longer theoretical. The costs are no longer hidden. What began as a dispute over a leaking roof has evolved into a reckoning over governance, responsibility, and the price of unchecked control. The question that remains is not whether the HOA will be held accountable, but how much of itself will survive the process of being exposed. The sixth stage of the fallout unfolded slowly at first, then all at once, like pressure that had been building underground finally finding a way out. By now, the HOA no longer controlled the tempo of events. Court calendars did. Insurance deadlines did. Regulatory agencies did. The neighborhood felt less like a managed community and more like a case study in institutional failure. Ordinary routines continued, but they felt fragile, as if everyone understood that normalcy was temporary and conditional. People waved to each other with a shared awareness that went unspoken, a recognition that they were all witnesses now, whether they wanted to be or not. The HOA board, once the loudest presence in the room, had become conspicuously quiet. Official communications dwindled to near silence, broken only by required legal disclosures that read more like warnings than updates. Residents noticed how language shifted yet again, how certainty was replaced by caution, how authority retreated behind phrases like pending review and subject to counsel. The confidence that once fueled enforcement had been replaced by fear of saying the wrong thing. My fines, which had been paused but not dismissed, sat in a strange limbo, neither enforced nor forgiven. That unresolved status mirrored the HOA itself, suspended between past behavior and future consequences. The ambiguity was intentional, a way to avoid admitting error while no longer daring to press the issue. It was a standoff between bureaucracy and reality was winning. As discovery progressed, more internal documents surfaced, and with them came a clearer picture of how decisions had truly been made. Approval logs revealed inconsistencies that could no longer be explained away. Similar projects received wildly different treatment. Some were scrutinized endlessly, others waved through in days. The criteria changed depending on who asked, when they asked, and who they knew. Safety checks were documented after the fact. Inspections were referenced without evidence they had occurred. What emerged was not chaos, but a pattern of convenience masquerading as governance. The HOA had not lacked rules. It had lacked discipline in applying them. That distinction mattered more than anyone had realized. Neighbors reacted differently as this information became more widely understood. Some felt vindicated, finally able to put words to frustrations they had buried for years. Others felt betrayed, grappling with the realization that the structure they trusted to protect their investment had actively undermined it. A few clung to denial, insisting that exposure would somehow resolve itself, that things would return to normal once the legal dust settled. But normal, it became clear, was no longer an option. The garage collapse had permanently altered the landscape, not just physically but psychologically. It had proven that the system could fail catastrophically, and that proof could not be unseen. The personal toll deepened. Families affected by the collapse faced mounting costs and uncertain timelines. Temporary solutions stretched into months. Stress seeped into daily life, affecting work, health, and relationships. These were consequences no policy revision could undo. They were the human cost of decisions made casually by people who never expected to be held accountable. That reality hardened the resolve of those pursuing legal action. This was no longer about principle alone. It was about restitution. Meanwhile, insurance carriers began pushing back aggressively. Coverage disputes escalated into formal challenges. The HOA's policies were scrutinized line by line, exclusions highlighted, limits tested. Insurers questioned whether negligence voided certain protections. The possibility that the HOA might be underinsured for the scale of damage became very real. That prospect sent a quiet shockwave through the community. Special assessments, once an abstract fear, became a looming threat. Homeowners calculated what they might owe, how much they could absorb, what they might lose. Conversations shifted from anger to strategy. People discussed selling, refinancing, protecting assets. The sense of shared vulnerability deepened bonds among some while isolating others. Through all of this, I remained an anchor point in the narrative, not by design, but by circumstance. My roof repair continued to serve as a control example, cited repeatedly in legal arguments and expert analyses. It demonstrated what proper process looked like when followed correctly, and how irrational it was for the HOA to punish it while enabling far riskier behavior elsewhere. I was asked again to clarify details, to confirm dates, to verify correspondence. Each request reinforced the same conclusion. This wasn't miscommunication, it was misuse of authority. The HOA's management company attempted to distance itself, suggesting that board directives limited their ability to enforce standards consistently. That argument failed quickly. Contracts showed advisory roles, not decision-making ones. Responsibility traced back to the board every time. The attempt to shift blame only highlighted how little ownership anyone was willing to take. As depositions concluded, summaries circulated among legal teams and word filtered back to the community. Testimony had been inconsistent. Memories conflicted. Explanations shifted under questioning. These weren't criminal proceedings, but credibility mattered, and it had been damaged. Residents began to understand that even if the HOA survived legally, it might not survive culturally. Trust, once broken at this scale, was difficult to rebuild. The authority to fine, approve, and enforce depended on belief as much as bylaws. That belief was gone. The physical removal of the collapsed garage had left an empty space that now felt symbolic. Where the structure once stood, there was absence, a gap that invited reflection. It was a daily reminder of what shortcuts cost and how easily confidence could be misplaced. Children asked questions. Visitors noticed. No explanation ever felt sufficient. The HOA's attempts to reframe the narrative faded into irrelevance against that silent testimony. Near the end of this phase, a formal notice arrived stating that all enforcement actions related to my roof were officially under administrative review with no timeline provided. It was the closest thing to an admission I would receive. Not an apology, not a correction, a pause. That pause carried weight. It acknowledged without saying so that the HOA no longer trusted its own position. As Chapter 6 closes, the community stands fully exposed to the consequences of governance without accountability. The systems meant to impose order have been overtaken by forces they cannot control. What remains is a reckoning not just with what happened, but with how easily it was allowed to happen, and whether anything built on that foundation can truly be trusted again. The 7th chapter of the fallout began with a shift that was less visible but more consequential than any legal filing or inspection report. It was the moment when residents stopped asking what would happen next and started asking what kind of future they were willing to accept. The HOA's authority had been weakened legally, but its real collapse was cultural. The unspoken agreement that once held the community together, that compliance would be rewarded with stability, no longer existed. In its place was a cautious awareness that order enforced without fairness eventually turns on itself. Daily life continued, but it felt provisional, like living in a house you knew was structurally compromised even after the obvious damage had been cleared away. People were polite, but guarded. Conversations carried an edge of calculation, each interaction filtered through the knowledge that governance had failed them once and could do so again. The HOA board, reduced in number and confidence, attempted to reassert relevance by proposing amendments to bylaws, new oversight committees, and revised approval processes. These proposals were framed as reforms, yet they arrived too late to restore trust. Residents now understood that rules were only as meaningful as the integrity of those enforcing them. No amount of procedural fine-tuning could compensate for the absence of accountability. The board's efforts felt reactive, shaped by fear rather than principle. That perception mattered. Authority driven by fear rarely inspires confidence. As legal proceedings moved closer to resolution, settlement discussions intensified. The injured neighbors sought compensation not just for repairs, but for displacement, loss of use, and diminished property value. Their demands were grounded in evidence, supported by expert testimony and documentation that traced failures directly to HOA decisions. The HOA's legal counsel attempted to limit exposure, arguing shared responsibility and unforeseen circumstances. Those arguments struggled against the weight of documentation that showed oversight failures were neither isolated nor accidental. The narrative of unpredictability could not survive evidence of pattern. Insurance carriers entered negotiations aggressively, motivated by their own interests. They pressed the HOA to accept responsibility in exchange for partial coverage, threatening denial if negligence was formally established. This created a new tension within the community. Some residents worried that fighting too hard would increase financial fallout. Others believed that compromise without accountability would set a dangerous precedent. The debate revealed a community no longer united by appearance, but divided by philosophy. What mattered more, minimizing immediate cost or restoring long-term integrity? My role remained unchanged. I continued to provide information when requested and declined to engage in speculation. Yet my situation evolved in subtle ways. The paused fines on my account became a quiet reference point, mentioned indirectly in meetings and correspondence. They symbolized unresolved authority, a reminder that the HOA's enforcement power had been compromised but not formally relinquished. That limbo mirrored the broader state of governance. The HOA existed, but its legitimacy was suspended. The impact extended beyond the immediate legal battle. Prospective buyers asked pointed questions during open houses. Disclosure statements grew longer. Real estate agents struggled to reassure clients without misrepresenting risk. Property values reflected uncertainty, not collapse but hesitation. The market responded not to damage but to doubt. Doubt, once introduced, lingered. Longtime residents faced difficult choices. Some considered leaving, unwilling to endure years of rebuilding trust. Others committed to staying, determined to reshape governance from within. New volunteers emerged, cautious but motivated, seeking to replace the culture that had allowed negligence to flourish. The idea of community shifted from compliance to participation. That transition was uneven and uncomfortable but necessary. The HOA, once an external authority, was being reimagined as something that required constant scrutiny and involvement. The garage site, now cleared, became an empty lot that no one quite knew how to interpret. It was no longer dangerous, but it was not reassuring either. It stood as a physical absence, a reminder of what had been lost and what had failed. Children played nearby, unbothered, while adults glanced at it with lingering unease. The contrast highlighted how deeply the incident had affected those who understood its implications. Ignorance, it seemed, was the only remaining insulation. Settlement talks reached a critical point when preliminary terms circulated. The HOA would accept liability for oversight failures. Insurance would cover a portion, but not all, of the damages. The remainder would be addressed through a combination of reserves and special assessments. The announcement landed heavily. Numbers were attached, timelines proposed. Suddenly, the abstract cost of negligence became personal. Residents calculated their share, weighing it against years of dues already paid. Anger resurfaced, but it was tempered by exhaustion. The desire for resolution competed with the need for justice. Some residents argued that the assessment, while painful, was necessary to move forward. Others viewed it as another injustice, compliant homeowners paying for mistakes they didn't make. The debate was intense but measured. The community had matured through crisis, learning to argue with evidence rather than emotion. That change, though born of hardship, was progress. Through it all, the contrast between my roof repair and the collapsed garage remained central. Experts referenced it as an example of how proper process prevented damage. Attorneys used it to illustrate selective enforcement. Neighbors cited it as proof that the system punished the wrong behaviors. It became a case study within a case, a simple story that cut through complexity. Fixing a roof with permits was penalized. Approving a major renovation without oversight led to collapse. That narrative required no embellishment. It spoke for itself. As Chapter 7 closes, the community stands on the brink of formal resolution, yet far from emotional closure. The structures that govern daily life have been challenged, exposed, and partially dismantled. What remains is a choice: rebuild authority on transparency and accountability, or retreat into complacency and risk repeating the same failures. The outcome will define not just the HOA's future, but the meaning of community itself in the aftermath of broken trust. The eighth phase did not arrive with relief, as many had expected, but with a strange and sobering clarity that only comes after prolonged uncertainty. The legal framework was finally taking shape, the outlines of settlement and responsibility becoming clearer, yet the emotional weight of what had occurred settled heavier than before. The community had crossed a threshold from reaction into consequence, and with that shift came an uncomfortable awareness that even when accountability is enforced, damage does not simply reverse itself. The HOA's authority, once assumed and unquestioned, now existed under constant scrutiny, its every action interpreted through the lens of past failure. Even routine notices were read carefully, analyzed for intent and implication, no longer trusted at face value. Residents had learned how fragile systems could be, and that knowledge changed how they moved through daily life. The settlement framework, though not yet finalized, was shared in broad terms, outlining responsibility, financial distribution, and structural reforms. It acknowledged oversight failures directly, language that would have been unthinkable months earlier. That admission alone marked a turning point. Yet acknowledgement did not feel like vindication. It felt like confirmation of something many had suspected for years but lacked proof to articulate. The sense of triumph that might have accompanied being proven right was absent. Instead, there was a muted acceptance that the cost of being right had been high. Families displaced by the collapse faced long-term adjustments, not just physical repairs but emotional ones. Their trust in managed safety had been permanently shaken. They spoke less about blame and more about recovery, focusing on stability rather than validation. That shift influenced the entire community. Attention moved away from winning arguments toward preventing recurrence. The HOA board, now reshaped through resignations and replacements, operated with visible caution. Decisions slowed, processes lengthened. Where authority once acted quickly, it now hesitated, aware that every shortcut carried reputational risk. This overcorrection frustrated some residents who wanted efficiency restored. Others welcomed it, seeing deliberation as a necessary corrective to years of unchecked discretion. The balance between governance and paralysis became a new challenge. My own situation remained unresolved in a way that felt increasingly symbolic. The fines tied to my roof repair still existed in documentation but had lost their power. They were neither enforced nor erased, suspended in a bureaucratic holding pattern that mirrored the HOA's broader uncertainty. I received informal assurances that the issue would be resolved once legal matters concluded, but nothing in writing. That ambiguity no longer provoked anger. It underscored how deeply the system had been destabilized. Authority that once acted decisively now avoided commitment. The contrast with the early days of enforcement was stark. Neighbors continued to reference my case as shorthand for the HOA's misaligned priorities. It had become part of the community's shared narrative, a cautionary example discussed with newcomers and cited in meetings as a reminder of what not to repeat. That role, though unintended, carried responsibility. I remained careful to keep my involvement factual and restrained, aware that exaggeration could undermine credibility. The power of the story lay in its simplicity, not in dramatization. As the settlement discussions advanced, financial realities set in more fully. Special assessments were outlined with clarity, amounts specified, payment options offered. The numbers were significant enough to hurt but structured to avoid immediate collapse. Residents reacted with a mix of resignation and resolve. Some tightened budgets, others reconsidered long-term plans. The cost of negligence, once abstract, had become a line item in household finances. That transformation altered perceptions of governance permanently. HOA decisions were no longer theoretical exercises. They were financial commitments with real consequences. This awareness reshaped engagement. Attendance at meetings increased not out of outrage but necessity. People wanted to understand, influence, and monitor decisions that directly affected their stability. The culture of passive compliance gave way to cautious participation. The empty lot where the garage had collapsed began to change, not through reconstruction but through planning. Proposals circulated about memorializing the incident in some small way, not as spectacle but as reminder. Others argued against it, preferring to move forward without physical reminders of failure. The debate revealed how differently people processed the same event. For some, memory was essential to prevention. For others, memory threatened to anchor the community in past trauma. No consensus emerged, and that lack of agreement was itself a sign of growth. The community was learning to live with complexity rather than suppress it. The legal process neared its conclusion, and with it came the realization that resolution would not restore what had been lost. It would simply define responsibility. Accountability, once achieved, did not rebuild trust automatically. Trust required sustained behavior change over time. That understanding tempered expectations. There would be no moment where everything felt normal again. Instead, there would be gradual adjustment, cautious optimism, and constant vigilance. The HOA, stripped of unquestioned authority, would have to earn legitimacy through consistency and transparency. Whether it could do so remained uncertain. My roof, solid and unremarkable, continued to function without issue. Its quiet reliability contrasted sharply with the upheaval it had helped expose. It stood as proof that systems work when followed correctly and fail when bent for convenience. That lesson, though costly, was now embedded in the community's collective consciousness. As Chapter 8 closes, the neighborhood exists in a state of uneasy stability. The major questions have been asked, most of the answers uncovered, yet the work of rebuilding trust has only begun. The consequences of negligence have been acknowledged, the price calculated, but the deeper reckoning, how to govern without repeating the same mistakes, remains an open challenge. The story is no longer about a roof or a collapsed garage. It is about what happens when authority is forced to confront the reality it tried to control, and how a community learns to move forward after the illusion of safety has been stripped away. The 9th chapter unfolded in a quieter register, not because the consequences had diminished, but because the community had learned to live inside them. The sharp edges of crisis softened into something heavier and more enduring, accountability as a daily condition rather than a dramatic event. The settlement documents moved closer to final signatures, drafts circulated with fewer changes each time, and the language settled into something almost clinical. Responsibility was defined. Financial obligations were outlined. Structural reforms were mandated. On paper, the conflict was resolving. In reality, the community was still recalibrating what it meant to exist without blind faith in authority. The HOA, now operating under the weight of oversight provisions and external scrutiny, functioned differently. Decisions were slower, communication more deliberate, and silence was no longer tolerated. Residents demanded explanations where once they had accepted instructions. This shift did not come with celebration. It came with fatigue. The emotional energy required to stay vigilant was substantial, and not everyone had it in equal measure. Some residents disengaged, exhausted by months of tension. Others leaned in further, determined not to let hard-earned awareness fade into complacency. The balance between these impulses defined the neighborhood's mood. My own role evolved subtly. Requests for documentation slowed as cases solidified, yet conversations about my situation continued in the background. The unresolved fines became less about money and more about precedent. People understood that how my case ended would signal whether the HOA truly accepted its failures or merely endured them. The longer the issue remained unresolved, the clearer it became that resolution required more than administrative action. It required acknowledgement. That acknowledgement remained elusive. Informal assurances continued, but formality was deferred, as if committing to correction might reopen wounds leadership hoped would scar over quietly. Meanwhile, the practical impact of the settlement began to touch daily life. Payment schedules arrived. Budget adjustments were made. The abstract cost of negligence was now divided into monthly obligations that appeared alongside mortgages and utilities. This normalization of consequence had a profound effect. It removed drama and replaced it with responsibility. Residents who once viewed HOA governance as background noise now understood it as a factor in their financial planning. That understanding altered behavior. Questions became more precise. Attendance became purposeful. A culture of documentation emerged, not out of paranoia but prudence. People saved emails, requested confirmations, and followed up in writing. The community had learned that memory was unreliable, but records endured. The empty lot where the garage once stood remained unchanged, a deliberate pause rather than neglect. Proposals for reconstruction were deferred until all obligations were settled. The space functioned as a silent checkpoint, a reminder that rebuilding without reflection risked repeating the same mistakes. Some residents avoided it. Others walked past deliberately, grounding their understanding of abstract governance in physical reality. The absence spoke more effectively than any sign or statement. As legal closure approached, attention turned toward governance reform. New committees formed with clearly defined scopes. External auditors were engaged. Oversight mechanisms were written into bylaws rather than suggested as best practices. These changes were not dramatic, but they were structural, designed to survive leadership turnover and collective amnesia. The HOA began to resemble an institution learning humility, though whether that humility would persist remained uncertain. Change implemented under pressure often faded once pressure lifted. Residents were keenly aware of that risk. Conversations shifted from what went wrong to how to prevent erosion of reform. This forward-looking focus marked a significant evolution. The community was no longer defined solely by what it opposed, but by what it intended to safeguard. Trust, however, remained fragile. Each interaction with the HOA was still filtered through skepticism. Transparency was demanded not because it was promised, but because it was necessary. The board responded with openness that felt practiced, sometimes overly so, as if aware that missteps would be amplified. This self-consciousness slowed progress but increased accuracy. Errors were corrected publicly. Questions were answered directly. The culture of defensiveness that once characterized enforcement gave way to cautious cooperation. It was not redemption, but it was movement. My roof repair, still the quiet origin of the unraveling, continued to function as an unintended benchmark. It was referenced less frequently now, its lesson internalized rather than debated. Yet the unresolved fines remained an irritant, a loose thread that prevented full closure. Neighbors occasionally asked whether I planned to push for resolution. I explained that resolution would come when the system was ready to acknowledge error without defensiveness. Pushing prematurely risked symbolic gestures without substantive change. Patience, though difficult, remained strategic. As the settlement neared finalization, the community faced a new kind of anxiety. What happens after the fight ends? Conflict, for all its cost, had provided clarity. Its absence would require sustained effort to maintain that clarity without the motivating force of opposition. Residents discussed mechanisms for ongoing accountability, rotating oversight roles, and transparent reporting. These conversations reflected a deeper understanding that governance was not a static structure, but a continuous process requiring participation. The HOA's future depended less on who held positions and more on whether the community remained engaged once the urgency faded. The emotional landscape shifted again, this time toward cautious acceptance. People began to imagine a future not defined by collapse, but informed by it. That imagination was tentative, shaped by scars rather than optimism, yet it represented progress. The community had moved beyond denial and outrage into something more durable, informed skepticism paired with responsibility. As Chapter 9 draws to a close, the story approaches its final resolution not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a collective decision about memory and vigilance. The systems that failed have been exposed, corrected, and constrained, but their true test lies ahead, in ordinary moments when attention wanes and convenience tempts shortcuts. The question is no longer whether the HOA was wrong, but whether the community will remember why, and whether that memory will be strong enough to prevent the same mistakes from taking root again when no one is watching. The final chapter did not arrive with a decisive victory or a dramatic collapse, but with something far more difficult to measure, a lasting change in how the community understood power. The settlement was finalized quietly, signatures collected, terms enacted, and obligations set into motion without ceremony. There were no speeches, no public acknowledgments, no moment where the HOA stood before the residents to confess or explain. Instead, the conclusion unfolded through routine notices, updated budgets, revised bylaws, and a calendar that slowly returned to something resembling normal. Yet normal was no longer what it had been. The community had crossed a point of no return, not because of what had happened, but because of what had been learned. Authority, once accepted as a given, was now understood as conditional. Compliance, once automatic, was now informed. The illusion that order alone guaranteed safety had been permanently dismantled. People lived differently with that knowledge, more attentive, more deliberate, and less willing to assume that silence meant competence. The HOA continued to exist, but it no longer felt like an untouchable institution. It felt like a tool, one that required constant oversight to function as intended. Meetings were calmer but sharper. Questions were fewer but more precise. Decisions took longer, not because of confusion, but because no one wanted speed to replace judgment again. The board members who remained understood this shift acutely. They spoke carefully, documented thoroughly, and avoided the informal shortcuts that once defined their authority. Whether this restraint would last was an open question, but for now it held. The special assessments began, payments spread over time, absorbed gradually into household budgets. The cost stung, but it was manageable, and more importantly, it was understood. Residents no longer wondered where their money was going or why. The transparency born from necessity became a new standard. Insurance disputes settled into final terms. Repairs progressed. Families displaced by the collapse slowly returned to stability, though not to innocence. The memory of disruption lingered in small ways. A hesitation during heavy rain, a pause when construction equipment appeared on the street, a reflexive urge to ask for documentation before trusting assurances. These were not signs of fear, but of awareness. The community had learned to question without hostility, to verify without paranoia. That balance, fragile and imperfect, represented growth. My own situation reached its resolution not through confrontation, but through inevitability. A formal notice arrived, understated and procedural, stating that all fines related to my roof repair had been dismissed retroactively, the account balance adjusted to zero. There was no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of error. Just correction. Months earlier, that might have felt insufficient. Now it felt appropriate. The correction mattered more than the words. It marked the end of a contradiction that had persisted long after its justification collapsed. Neighbors noticed quietly, the news spreading without celebration. The resolution wasn't a win, it was closure. The roof that had started everything remained unchanged, solid, and unremarkable, doing exactly what it was meant to do. In its ordinariness lay its significance. It had exposed a system not through rebellion, but through compliance. That lesson resonated more deeply than any dramatic protest ever could. The empty lot where the garage had once stood was finally addressed. Reconstruction plans moved forward, this time under intense scrutiny, multiple inspections, and layered approvals. Progress was slow, but confidence was higher. The community watched closely, not out of suspicion, but responsibility. When the structure finally began to rise again, it did so under the weight of collective memory, every beam a reminder of what diligence looked like when properly applied. The HOA documented every step publicly, aware that secrecy was no longer an option. That transparency, though initially forced, became a habit. Habits over time shape culture. As the months passed, attention gradually shifted away from the incident itself and toward the future it had reshaped. New residents moved in, curious about the community's reputation, asking careful questions during introductions. Longtime residents answered honestly, not with bitterness, but with clarity. They spoke of mistakes, consequences, and lessons learned. The story of the collapse became part of the neighborhood's identity, not as a scandal, but as a turning point. It was referenced not to assign blame, but to explain why things were done differently now. The community had become self-aware, a rare quality that resisted complacency. Looking back, it was clear that the conflict had never been about a roof or a garage alone. It had been about the quiet danger of unchecked authority and the false comfort of appearance over substance. The HOA had enforced rules aggressively where it was easy and ignored them where it was inconvenient. That imbalance had persisted for years because it went unchallenged. The challenge did not come from defiance, but from documentation, patience, and consistency. It came from allowing the system to reveal itself through its own actions. The collapse merely accelerated what was already unstable. The true reckoning occurred when the community chose not to look away. In the end, no one emerged as a hero. There were no villains defeated in a single dramatic moment. What emerged instead was a collective understanding that governance is only as strong as the scrutiny it invites. Rules without accountability are theater. Authority without transparency is risk. The community learned these truths the hard way, through cost and discomfort, but they learned them fully. As life settled into its new rhythm, quieter but more intentional, the neighborhood no longer defined itself by perfection. Lawns were still trimmed, houses still aligned, but the obsession with appearance had softened. Substance mattered more now. Safety mattered more. Fairness mattered more. The illusion of peace had been replaced by the practice of responsibility. That transformation did not erase the past, but it gave it meaning. The story that began with a simple roof repair ended with a community that understood itself better, aware that order is not something imposed from above, but something sustained collectively through vigilance, integrity, and the willingness to question power before it fails again.